Ranger's Apprentice, Book 1, The Ruins of Gorlan, by John Flanagan. Chapter 22. Will was in the open meadow behind Halt's cottage, practicing. He had 4 targets set up at different ranges and was alternating his shot at random between the 4 of them, never firing at the same one twice in a row. Halt had set the exercise for him before he had gone to the Baron's office to discuss a dispatch that had come in from the king. "If you fire twice at the same target," he had said, "you'll begin to rely on your first shot to determine your direction and elevation. That way you'll never learn to shoot instinctively. You'll always need to fire a sighting shot first." Will knew his teacher was right, but that didn't make the exercise any easier. To add to the difficulty, Halt had stipulated that he should let no more than 5 seconds elapse between each shot. Frowning in concentration, he had let the last 5 arrows of a set go. One after the other in rapid succession, they flashed across the meadow, thudding into the target. Will, his quiver empty for the 10th time that morning, stopped to survey the results. He nodded in satisfaction. Every arrow had hit a target, and most of them were clustered in the inner ring of the bull or the bullseye itself. It was shooting of an exceptionally high quality, and it proved to him the value of constant practice. He wasn't to know, of course, but there were already few archers in the kingdom outside of the Ranger Corps who could have matched him. Even the archers in the king's army weren't trained to shoot with such individual speed and accuracy. They were trained to fire as a group, sending a mass of arrows against an attacking force. As a result, their training concentrated more on coordinated actions, so that all arrows were fired simultaneously. He had just set the bow down, preparatory to recovering his arrows, when the sound of a footstep behind him made him turn. He was a little surprised to see 3 battleschool apprentices watching him, the red surcoats marking them as second-year trainees. He didn't recognize any of them, but he nodded a friendly greeting. "Good morning. What brings you down here?" It was unusual to find battleschool apprentices this far from the castle. He noted the thick canes that they all carried and decided they must have set out for a walk. The closest of them, a handsome blonde-haired boy, smiled and said, "We're looking for the Ranger's Apprentice." Will couldn't help smiling in return. After all, the ranger cloak that he wore marked him unmistakably as an apprentice ranger. But perhaps the battleschool apprentices was only being polite. "Well, you found him. What can I do for you?" "We've brought a message from the battleschool for you," the boy replied. Like all battleschool trainees, he was tall and well-muscled, as were his companions. They moved closer to him now, and Will instinctively backed off a pace. They were a little too close, he felt. Closer than they needed to be to pass on a message. "It's about what happened at the boar hunt," said one of the others. This one was red-haired, with a heavy dusting of freckles, and a nose that showed distinct signs of having been broken. Probably in one of the training combats that battleschool students were always practicing. Will shrugged uncomfortably. There was something in the air he didn't like. The blond boy was smiling still, but neither the redhead nor the third companion, an olive-skinned boy who was the tallest of the 3, looked as if they thought there was anything to smile about. "You know," Will said, "people are talking a lot of nonsense about that. I didn't do much." "We know," the redhead boy snapped angrily at it again. Again Will took a pace back as they all moved a little closer. Halt's training was ringing alarm bells in his mind now. "Never let people get too close to you," he'd been told. "If they try to, be on your guard, no matter who they are or how friendly you think they are. But when you go swanking around telling everyone you saved a big, clumsy battleschool apprentice, you make us look foolish," the tall boy accused. Will looked at him frowning. "I never said that," he protested. And at that moment, while he was distracted by Bryn, Alder made his move, stepping quickly forward with the sack held open to overthrow Will's head. It was the same tactic they had used to successfully with Horace, but Will was already on his guard, and as the other boy moved, he sensed the attack and reacted. Unexpectedly, he dived forward towards Alder, rolling in a somersault that took him under the sack, then letting his legs sweep around, scything Alder's legs from under him, so that the bigger boy was sent sprawling. But there were 3 of them, and that was too many for him to keep track of. He'd evaded Alder and Bryn, but as he rolled to his feet, completing the movement, Jerome brought his cane around in a ringing crack across the back of his shoulders. With a cry of pain and shock, Will staggered forward as Bryn now brought his cane around and hit him across the side. By then Alder had regained his feet, furious with the way Will had evaded him, and he struck Will across the point of the shoulder. The pain was excruciating, and with a sob of agony, Will dropped to his knees. Instantly, the 3 battle school apprentices crowded forward, wringing him, trapping him between them. The heavy canes raised to continue the beating. "That's enough!" The unexpected voice stopped them. Will crouched on the ground, waiting for the beating to begin. Arms over his head, looked up and saw Horace, bruised and battered, standing a few meters away. He held one of the wooden battle school drill swords in his right hand. One eye was blackened, and there was a trickle of blood running from his lip. But in the eyes there was a look of hatred and sheer determination that for a moment made the 3 older boys hesitate. Then they realized that there were 3 of them, and Horace's sword was, after all, no more of a weapon than the canes they carried. Forgetting Will for a moment, they fanned out and moved to encircle Horace, the heavy canes raised to strike. "Baby followed us," said Alder. "Baby wants another beating," Jerome agreed. "And Baby's got to get it," said Bryn, smiling confidently. But then a yell of fright was torn from his lips as a sudden jarring force slammed against the cane, whipping it from his grasp and sending it spinning to land several meters away. A similar yell to the right told him that the same thing had happened to Jerome. Confused, Bryn looked around to where the 2 canes lay. With a sinking feeling, he saw that each one was transfixed by a black-shafted arrow. "I think one at a time is fair, don't you?" Bryn and Jerome felt a surge of terror as they looked up to see the grim-faced ranger standing in the shadows 10 meters away, another arrow already knocked on the string of his massive longbow. Only Alder showed any sign of rebellion. "This is battle school business, Ranger," he said, trying to bluster his way through the situation. "You'd best stay out of it." Will, slowly regaining his feet, saw the dark anger that burned deep in Halt's eyes at the arrogant words. For a moment he almost felt sorry for Alder. Then he felt the throbbing pain in his back and shoulders, and any thought of sympathy were instantly blotted out. "Battle school business, is it, Sonny?" Halt said in a dangerously low voice. He moved forward, covering the ground between him and Alder in a few deceptively swift gliding steps. Before Alder knew it, Halt was barely a meter away. Still, the apprentice remained defiant. The dark look on Halt's face was unsettling, but seen close up, Alder realized that he was a good head taller than the ranger, and his confidence flowed back. All these years he had been nervous of the mysterious man who now stood before him. He had never realized that a puny figure he really was. Which was Alder's second mistake of the day. Halt was small, but not puny. In addition, Halt had spent a lifetime fighting far more dangerous adversaries than a second-year battle school apprentice. "I seem to notice that there was a ranger apprentice being attacked. I think that makes it ranger business as well. Don't you?" Alder shrugged, confident now that whatever the ranger might do, he could more than handle it. "Make it your business if you like," he said in a sneer entering his voice. "I really don't care one way or the other." Halt nodded several times as he digested that speech. Then he replied, "Well then, I think I will make it my business, but I won't be needing this." As he said it, he replaced the arrow in his quiver and lightly tossed the bow to one side, turning away as he did so. Inadvertently, Alder's eyes followed the action, and instantly he felt a searing pain as Halt stamped backward with the edge of his boot, catching the apprentice's foot went between arc and ankle, driving into it. As Alder doubled over to clasp his injured foot, the ranger pivoted on his left heel, and his right elbow slammed upward into Alder's nose, jerking him upright again and sending him staggering back, eyes streaming with pain. For a second or two, Alder's sight was blurred by the reflex tears, and he felt a slight prickling sensation under his chin. As his eyes cleared, he found the ranger's eyes were only a few centimeters from his own. There was no anger there. Instead, there was a look of utter contempt and disregard, though somehow far more frightening. The pricking sensation became a little more pronounced, and as he tried to look down, Alder gave a gasp of fear. Halt's larger knife, razor-edged and needle-pointed, was just under his chin, pressing lightly into the soft flesh of his throat. "Don't ever talk to me like that again, boy," the ranger said so softly that Alder had to strain to hear the words. "And don't ever lay a hand on my apprentice again. Understand?" Alder, all his arrogance gone, his heart pounding in terror, could say nothing. The knife pricked a little harder against his throat, and he felt a warm trickle of blood sliding down his collar. Halt's eyes blazed suddenly, like the coals of a fire in a sudden draft. "Understand?" he repeated, and Alder croaked a reply. Yes, sir." Halt stepped back. He resheathed the knife in one fluid movement. Alder sank to the ground, massaging his injured ankle. He was sure there was damage to the tendons. Ignoring him, Halt turned to face the other two second-year apprentices. Instinctively, they had moved closer together and were watching him fearfully uncertain as to what he was going to do next. Halt pointed to Bryn. "You," he said, his voice edged with contempt. "Pick up your cane." Fearfully, Bryn moved to where his cane lay on the ground. Halt's arrow still embedded halfway along its length. Without taking his eyes off the ranger, fearing some trick, he stooped at the knees, his hand scrambling awkwardly until it touched the cane. Then he stood again, holding it uncertainly in his left hand. "Now give me back my arrow," the ranger ordered, and the tall, swarthy boy struggled to remove the arrow, stepping close enough to hand it to Halt, tensed in every muscle as he waited for some unexpected move from the ranger. Halt merely took the arrow and replaced it in his quiver. Bryn stepped hurriedly back out of reach. Halt gave a small, contemptuous laugh. Then he turned to Horace. "I take it these are the three who gave you those bruises?" he asked. Horace said nothing for a moment, then realized that his continued silence was ridiculous. There was no reason why he should shield the three bullies any further. There never had been a reason. "Yes, sir," he said decisively. Halt nodded, rubbing his chin. "I rather thought so. Well then, I've heard rumors that you're pretty good with a sword. How about a practice bout with this hero in front of me?" A slow grin spread over Horace's face as he understood what the ranger was suggesting. He started forward. "I think I'd like that." Bryn backed away a pace. Just a moment. You can't expect me to..." He got no further. The ranger's eyes glittered with the dangerous light once more, and he took half a step forward, his hand dropping to the hilt of the sax knife again. "You got a cane. I suggest you use it. Now get on with it," he ordered. His voice was very low and dangerous. Realizing he was trapped, Bryn turned to face Horace. Now that it was a matter of one-on-one, he felt far less confident about dealing with the younger boy. Everyone had heard of Horace's almost uncanny natural swordsmanship. Deciding that the attack might be the best defense, Bryn stepped forward and aimed an overhead slash at Horace. Horace parried it easily. He parried Bryn's next two strokes with equal ease. Then as he blocked Bryn's fourth stroke, he flicked his wooden blade down the length of the other boy's cane in an instant before the two weapons disengaged. There was no crosspiece to protect Bryn's hand from the movement, and the hardwood drill sword slammed painfully into his fingers. With a cry of agony, he dropped the heavy stick, leaping back and wringing his injured hand painfully under his arm. Horace stood ready to resume. "I didn't hear anybody call stop," Halt said mildly. But he disarmed me," Bryn whined. Halt smiled at him. "So he has, but I'm sure he'll let you pick up your cane and start again. Go ahead." Bryn looked from Halt to Horace and back again. He showed no pity in either face. I don't want to," he said in a very small voice. Horace found it hard to reconcile this cringing figure with this sneering bully who had been marking his life a hell for the past few months. Halt appeared to consider Bryn's statement. "We'll note your protest. Now continue." Bryn's hand throbbed painfully, but even worse than the pain was the fear of what was to come, the certainty that Horace would punish him without mercy. He bent down and reached fearfully for the cane, his eyes fixed on Horace. The younger boy waited patiently until Bryn was ready, then made a sudden feint forward. Bryn yelped in fear and threw the cane aside. Horace shook his head in disgust. "Who's the baby now?" he asked. Bryn wouldn't meet his gaze. He shrank away, his eyes cast down. "If he's going to be a baby, I suppose you'll just have to paddle him," Halt suggested. A grin spread over Horace's face. He sprang forward and grabbed Bryn by the scruff of his neck, spinning him around. Then he proceeded to whack the older boy's backside with the flat of the drill sword over and over again, following him around the clearing as Bryn tried to pull away from the remorseless punishment. Bryn howled and hopped and sobbed, but Horace's grip was firm on his collar, and there was no escape. Finally, when Horace felt he had repaid all the bullying, the insults and the pain that he had suffered, he let go. Bryn staggered away and dropped to his hands and knees, sobbing with pain and fear. Jerome had watched the proceedings in horror. Knowing his turn was coming, he began to edge away, hoping to escape while the ranger's attention was distracted. "Take one more step, and I'll put an arrow through you." Will tried to model his voice on the quiet, threatening tone Halt had used. He had retrieved several of his arrows from the nearest target, and now he had one of them ready laid on the bowstring. Halt glanced around approvingly. "Good idea. Aim for the left calf. It's a very painful wound." He glanced over to where Bryn lay sobbing on the ground at Horace's feet. "I think he's had enough." Then he jerked a thumb at Jerome. "Your turn." Horace retrieved the cane that Bryn had dropped and moved toward Jerome, holding it out to him. Jerome backed away. "No!" Jerome yelled wide-eyed. It's not fair, "Well, of course it's not fair," Halt agreed in reasonable tone. "I gather you think 3 against 1 is fair. Now get on with it." Will had often heard the saying that a cornered rat will eventually show fight. Jerome proved it now. He went on to the attack, and to his own surprise, Horace gave him ground before the rain of blows aimed at him. The bully's confidence began to grow as he advanced. He failed to notice that Horace was blocking every stroke with a consummative ease, almost with contempt. Jerome's best strokes never even looked like they were breaking through Horace's defense. The second-year apprentice might as well have been hitting a stone wall. Then Horace stopped retreating. He stood fast, blocking Jerome's last stroke with an iron wrist. They stood chest to chest for a few seconds, and then Horace began to push Jerome back. His left hand gripped Jerome's right wrist, keeping their weapons locked together. Jerome's feet skidded in the snow as Horace forced him backwards, further and further. Then he gave a final heave and sent Jerome sprawling on the ground. Jerome had seen what had happened to Bryn. He knew that surrender wasn't an option. He scrambled to his feet and defended himself desperately as Horace began his own attack. Jerome was driven back by a whirlwind of forehands, backhands, side and overhead cuts. He managed to block some of that strokes, but the blistering speed of Horace's attack defeated him. Blow rains on his shins, elbows, and shoulders, almost at will. Horace seems to concentrate on the bony spots that would hurt the most. Occasionally he used the rounded point of the sword to thrust into Jerome's ribs, just hard enough to bruise without breaking bones. Finally, Jerome had had enough. He whirled away from the onslaught, dropped the cane and fell to the ground, hand clasped protectively over his head. His backside was raised invitingly in the air, and Horace paused and looked questioned at Halt. The ranger made a little gesture towards Jerome. "Why not? An opportunity like that doesn't come every day." But even he winced at the thundering kick in the backside that Horace delivered Jerome. Nose down in the wet snow, skidded at least a meter from the force of it. Halt retrieved the cane that Jerome had dropped. He studied it for a moment, testing its weight and balance. Really not much of a weapon. You have to wonder why they chose it. Then he tossed the cane to Alder. "Get busy." The blond boy still crouched, nursing his injured ankle, looked at the cane in disbelief. Blood streamed down his face from his shattered nose. He'd never be quite so good-looking again, Will thought. But I'm injured," he protested, hobbling awkwardly to his feet. He couldn't believe that Halt would require him to go through the punishment he'd just witnessed. Halt paused, studying him, as if that fact hadn't occurred to him. For a moment, a ray of hope shone on Alder's mind. So you are. He looked a little disappointed. and Alda began to believe that Halt's sense of fair play would spare him the sort of punishment that had been handed out to his friends. Then the ranger's face cleared. "But just a minute. So is Horace. Isn't that right, Will?" Will grinned. "Definitely." And Alda's brief hope vanished without a trace. Halt now turned to Horace, asking him with much concern, Are you sure you're not too badly injured to continue, Horace?" Horace smiled. It was a smile that never reached his eyes. "I think I can barely manage," he said. "Well, that's settled then. Let's continue, shall we?" And Alda knew that there was to be no escape from him either. He faced up to Horace, and the final duel began. Alda was the best swordsman of the three bullies, and at least he gave Horace some competition for a few minutes, but as they felt each other out with stroke and counterstroke, thrust and parry, he quickly realized that Horace was his master. His only chance, he felt, was to try something unexpected. He disengaged, then changed his grip on the cane, holding it in both hands like a quarterstaff, and launching a series of rapid left and right hooking blows with it. For a second, Horace was caught by surprise, and he fell back, but he recovered with cat-like speed and aimed an overhead blow at Alda. The second-year student attempted the standard quarterstaff parry, holding the staff at either end to block the sword stroke with the middle section. In theory, it was the right tactic. In practice, the hardened hickory drill sword simply sheared through the cane, leaving Alda holding two useless shortened sticks. Totally unnerved, he let them drop and stood defenseless before Horace. Horace looked at his long-term tormentor, then at the sword in his hand. "I don't need this," he muttered, and let the sword drop. The right-hand punch that he threw traveled no more than 20 centimeters to the point of Alda's jaw, but it had his shoulder and body weight and months of suffering and loneliness behind it, the loneliness that only a victim of bullying can throw. Will's eyes widened slightly as Alda came off his feet and hurtled backwards, to come crashing down on the cold snow beside his two friends. He thought about the times in the past when he had fought with Horace. If he'd known the other boy was capable of throwing a punch like that, he would never have done so. Alda didn't move. Odds were he wouldn't move for some time, Will thought. Horace stepped back, shaking his bruised knuckles and heaving a sigh of satisfaction. "You have no idea how good that felt," he said. "Thank you, Ranger." Halt nodded acknowledgement. "Thank you for taking a hand when they attacked Will. And by the way, my friends call me Halt." Chapter 23. In the weeks following his final encounter with the three bullies, Horace had noticed a definite change in his life at battle school. The most important factor in the change was that Alda, Bryn, and Jerome were all expelled from the school, and from the castle and its neighboring village. Sir Rodney had been suspicious for some time, and there had been a problem among the ranks of his junior students. A quiet visit from Halt alerted him as to where it lay, and the resultant investigation soon brought to light the full story of the way Horace had been victimized. Sir Rodney's judgment was swift and uncompromising. The 3 second-year students were given a half a day to prepare and pack. They were supplied with a small amount of money and a week's supply, and were transported to the fief's boundaries, where they were told in no certain terms not to return. Once they were gone, Horace's lot improved considerably. The daily routine of the battle school was still as harsh and challenging as ever, but without the added burden that Alda, Bryn, and Jerome had laid upon him. He found that he could easily cope with the drills, the discipline, and the studies. He rapidly began to achieve this potential that Sir Rodney had seen in him. In addition, his roommates, without the fear of incurring the bully's vengeance, began to be more welcoming and friendly. In short, Horace felt that things were definitely looking up. His only regret was that he hadn't been able to thank Halt properly for what he had done in his life. After the events in the meadow, Horace had been placed in the infirmary for several days while his bruises and contusions were tended to. By the time he was released, he found that Halt and Will had already left for the Rangers' gathering. "Are we nearly there?" Will asked for perhaps the 10th time that morning. Halt gave vent to a small sigh of aspiration. Other than that, he made no reply. They'd been on the road now for 3 days, and it seemed to Will that they must be close to the gathering ground. Several times in the past hour he had noticed an unfamiliar scent on the air. He mentioned it to Halt, who said briefly, "It's salt. We're getting close to the sea," then refused to elaborate any further. Will glanced sidelong at his teacher, hoping that perhaps Halt might deign to share a little more information with him, but the ranger's keen eyes were scanning the ground. And time to time, Will noticed he looked up into the trees that flanked the road. Are you looking for something?" Will asked, and Halt turned his saddle. "Finally, a useful question. Yes, as a matter of fact, I am. The chief ranger will have sentries out and around the gathering ground. I always like to try to fool them as I'm approaching." "Why?" asked Will, and Halt allowed himself a tight little grin. "It keeps them on their toes. They'll try to slip behind us and follow us, just so they can say they ambushed me. It's a silly game they like to play." "Why is it silly?" asked Will. It sounded exactly like the sort of skilled exercise that he and Halt practiced regularly. The grizzled ranger turned in his saddle and fixed Will with an unblinking stare. "Because they never succeed. And this year they'll be trying even harder, because they know I'm bringing an apprentice. They'll want to see how good you are." "Is this part of the testing?" Will asked, and Halt nodded. "It's the start of it. Do you remember what I told you last night?" Will nodded. For the past 2 nights around the campfire, Halt's soft voice had given Will advice and instructions on how to conduct himself at the gathering. Last night they devised tactics for use in case of an ambush. Just the sort of thing that Halt had mentioned now. "When will he began, but suddenly Halt was alert. He held up a warning finger for silence, and Will stopped speaking in an instant. The ranger's head was turned slightly to listen. The 2 horses continued without hesitation. "Hear it?" Will craned his head too. He thought that just maybe he could hear soft hoofbeats behind them, but he wasn't sure. The gait of their own horses masked any real sound from the trail behind. If there was someone there, his horse was moving in step with their own. "Change gait. 1, 3. 1, 2, 3. Simultaneously, they both nudged their horses' toes, their left toes into the horses' shoulders. It was just one of the many signals to which Took and Abelard was trained to respond. Instantly, both horses hesitated in their stride. They seemed to skip a pace, then continued in their own even gait. But the hesitation had changed the pattern of their hoofbeats, and for an instant Will could hear another set of horses' hooves behind them. Like a slightly delayed echo, then the other horse changed gait as well, to match their own, and the sound was gone. "Ranger horse. It'll be Gilan for sure." "How can you tell?" "Only a ranger horse could change his pace as quickly as that, and it'll be Gilan because it's always Gilan. He loves trying to catch me out." "Why?" asked Will, and Halt looked sternly at him. "Because he was my last apprentice, and for some reason former apprentices just love to catch their former masters with their breeches down." He looked accusingly at his current apprentice. Will was about to protest that he would never behave in such a fashion after he graduated, then realized that he probably would, and at the very first opportunity even. The protest died unspoken. Halt signaled for silence and scanned the trail ahead of them. Then he pointed. "That's the spot there. Ready?" There was a large tree close to the side of the trail, with branches hanging out just above the head height. Will studied it for a moment, then nodded. Took and Abelard continued their even pacing towards the tree. As they came closer, Will kicked his feet from the stirrups and rose to stand. Crouching on Took's back, the horse didn't vary his pace as his master shifted position. As they passed under the branches, Will reached up and seized the lowest one, swinging himself up onto it. The instant his weight left Took's back, the little horse began to pace more vigorously, forcing his hoof into the ground with each step, so that there would be no sign to a tracker behind him that his load had suddenly lightened. Silently, Will climbed higher into the tree, until he found a spot where he had a solid perch and clear view. He could see Halt and the 2 horses moving slowly down the trail. As they reached the next bend, Halt urged Took to keep going, then halted Abelard and swung them from the saddle. He dropped to his knees, seeming to study the ground for signs of tracks. Now Will could hear the other horse behind them. He looked back the way they'd come, but another bend hid their follower from sight. Then the soft hoofbeats ceased. Will's mouth was dry and his heart beat faster and faster inside his ribcage. He was sure the sound must be audible to anyone within 50 meters or so. But his training asserted itself, and he stood motionless in the tree branches among the leaves and dappled shadows, watching the trail behind them. A movement! He saw it from the corner of his eyes. Then it was gone. He peered closely at the spot for a second or two, then remembered Halt's lesson. Don't focus your attention on one spot. Keep a wide focus all the time and keep scanning. You'll see him as a movement, not as a figure. Remember, he's a ranger too, and he's been trained in the art of not being seen. Will widened his focus and scanned the forest behind them. Within seconds he was rewarded by another sign of movement. A branch swung back into place as an unseen figure passed silently by, and 10 meters further on a bush swayed slightly. Then he saw a clump of tall grass bringing slowly back into position from where a passing foot had crossed it momentarily. Will stayed rock still. He marveled at the fact that their pursuer could move through the forest without his seeing him. Obviously, the other ranger had left his horse behind and was stalking Halt on foot. Will's eyes swiveled for a quick glance at Halt. His teacher still seemed to be preoccupied with some sign on the ground. Another movement came from the forest. The unseen ranger had paused. Will's hiding place now was moving back towards the trail, intent on surprising Halt from behind. Suddenly, a tall figure in a grey-green cloak seemed to rise out of the ground in the middle of the trail, some 20 meters behind the kneeling figure of Halt. Will blinked. One moment the figure hadn't been there. Next he seemed to materialize out of thin air. Will's hand began to move towards the quiver of arrows slung over his back. Then he halted the movement. Halt had told him the night before. Wait until we're talking. If he's not talking, he'll hear the slightest movement you make. Will gulped, hoping that the tall figure hadn't heard the movement of his hand towards the quiver. But it seemed that he had stopped in time. Below him he heard a cheerful voice call out, "Halt! Halt!" Halt turned and rose slowly to his feet, brushing the dirt from his knees as he rose. He put his head on one side and studied the figure in the middle of the trail, who was leaning easily on a longbow identical to Halt's. "Well, Gilan, I see you're still making that old joke." Tall Ranger shrugged and replied cheerfully, "The joke appears to be on your side this year, Halt." As Gilan spoke, Will's hand moved quickly but quietly to his quiver and selected an arrow, laying it ready on the bowstring. Halt was speaking again now. "Really? And what joke would that be, I wonder?" The amusement was evident in Gilan's voice as he replied to his old master. "Come now, Halt, admit it. For once I've got the best of you, and you know how many years I've been trying." Halt rubbed his one hand over his grizzled beard thoughtfully. "It beats me why you keep trying, Gilan, as a matter of fact." Gilan laughed. "You should know how much pleasure it gives an ex-apprentice to get the better of his master. Halt, come on, admit it, this year I've won." As the tall figure spoke, Will carefully drew back the arrow, sighting on a tree trunk some 2 meters to Gilan's left. Halt's instructions echoed in his ears. "Choose a target close enough to startle him when you shoot, but for pity's sake, not too close. If he moves, I don't want you to put an arrow through him." Halt hadn't moved from his position in the center of the trail. Gilan was now shifting his weight uneasily from one foot to another. Halt's unperturbed manner was beginning to bother him. It appeared that all of a sudden he wasn't totally sure that Halt was merely trying to bluff his way out of the trap. Halt's next words added to his suspicions. "Ah, yes, apprentices and masters. They're a strange combination, all right. But tell me, Gilan, my old apprentice, aren't you forgetting something this year?" Perhaps it was the way Halt laid a little extra stress on the word apprentice, for suddenly Gilan became aware that he had made a mistake. His head began to turn, searching for the apprentice he had forgotten. As he began the movement, Will released his arrow. The shaft hissed through the air past the tall ranges and thudded quivering into the tree that Will had selected. Gilan jerked back, which shook. Then his eyes swung into the branches of the tree where Will stood concealed. Will marveled that even caught by surprise as he was, Gilan was still able to react so quickly in identifying the direction from which his attacker had shot. Gilan shook his head ruefully. His keen eyes could make out the small grey and green-clad figure concealed in the shadows of the tree foliage. Calm down, Will, Halt said, and meet Gilan, one of our more careless rangers. He shook his head at Gilan. I told you when you were a boy, didn't I? Never be too hasty. Don't rush into things. Gilan nodded, somewhat crestfallen. He looked even more so when Will dropped to the ground from the lowest branch, and the tall ranger saw how small and young the apprentice was. It appears, he said, that I was so intent on catching myself an old grey fox that I overlooked a small monkey hiding in the trees. He grinned at his own mistake. Monkey, I said. I'd say he'd made a monkey out of you today. Well, this is Gilan, my former apprentice and now ranger of Merrick Fief, although what they did to deserve him is beyond me. Gilan's grin widened and he held out his hand to Will. And just as I was thinking I'd finally get the better of you, Halt, he said cheerfully. So, you're Will, he continued, shaking his hand firmly. I'm pleased to meet you. That was a nice, neat piece of work, young fellow. Will grinned at Halt, and the older ranger made a slight, meaningful movement of his head. Will remembered the final instructions that Halt had given the night before. Once you best a man, never gloat, be generous, and find something in his actions to praise. He won't enjoy being bested, but he'll make a good face of it. Show him you appreciate it. Praise can win you a friend. Gloating will only ever make enemies. Yes, I'm Will, he said. Then he added, could you perhaps teach me how you move like that? It was brilliant. Gilan laughed ruefully. Not too brilliant, I think. You obviously saw me coming from a long way away. Will shook his head, remembering how hard he'd tried to spot Gilan. Now that he thought of it, his praise and his requests were more genuine than he realized. I saw you when you arrived, and I saw where you'd been, but I never once saw you from the time you rounded that bend. I wish I could move like that. Gilan's face showed his pleasure at Will's obvious sincerity. Well, Halt, he said, I see this young fellow doesn't merely have talent. He has excellent manners as well. Halt regarded the two of them, his current apprentice and his former student. He nodded to Will, approving his tactful words. Unseen movement was always Gilan's best skill, he said. You'd do well if he agreed to tutor you. He moved towards his ex-apprentice and placed his arm around the taller man's shoulders. It's good to see you again. They embraced each other warmly. Then Halt held the other man's arm at length, studying him carefully. You get lankier every year, when you're going to put some meat on those bones. Gilan smiled. It was obviously an old joke between them. You appear to have enough for both of us, he said. He poked Halt in the ribs none too gently. Is that the beginning of a pot belly I see there? He grinned at Will. I'll wager he's sitting around the cabin letting you do all the housework these days. Before Halt or Will could reply, he turned away and let out a whistle. A few seconds later, his horse trotted around the bend in the road. As the tall young ranger moved towards his horse and mounted, Will noticed a sword hanging in his scabbard from the saddle. He turned to Halt, puzzled. I thought we weren't allowed to have swords, he said quietly. Halt frowned for a moment, not understanding, then followed Will's gaze and realized what had prompted the question. It's not that we're not allowed, he explained as they both mounted. It's a matter of priorities. It takes years to become a good swordsman, and we don't have the time. We have other skills to develop. He saw the next question forming on Will's lips and went on. Gilan's father is a knight, so Gilan had already been training with the sword for some years before he joined the Rangers. He was considered a special case, and he was allowed to continue that training when he was apprenticed to me. But I thought, Will began and then hesitated. Gilan was trotting his horse towards them, and he wasn't sure if it would be polite to ask his next question in front of him. Never say that in front of Halt, Gilan said, overhearing Will's last words. He'll simply reply, You're an apprentice, you're not ready to think. Or, if you thought about it, you wouldn't ask. Will had to smile. Halt had used those exact words to him on more than one occasion, and Gilan's impersonation of the older ranger was uncanny. Now, however, both men were looking expectantly at him, waiting to hear the question he had been about to ask, so he plunged ahead. If Gilan's father was a knight, wasn't he automatically eligible for battleschool? Or did they think he was too small as well? Halt and Gilan exchanged a look. Halt raised one eyebrow, then gestured for Gilan to reply. I could have gone to battle school, he said, but I chose to join the Rangers. Some of us do, you know, Halt put in mildly. Will thought this over. He had always assumed that the Rangers did not come from the ranks of the kingdom nobles. Apparently he was wrong. But I thought, he began, and instantly realized his mistake. Halt and Gilan looked at him, then looked at each other and said in chorus, "You're an apprentice. You're not ready to think." And they wheeled their horses and trotted off. Will hurriedly retrieved Tuck and cantered after them. As he caught up to the two rangers, edged the horse to the other side, allowing him space to ride between them. Gilan grinned once at him. Halt was as grim as ever. But as they continued in uncompanionable silence, Will became aware of the comforting realization that he was now part of an exclusively tightly knit group. It was a warm sense of belonging, as if somehow he had arrived home for the first time in his life.